deal, saying Russia had betrayed its trust and acted ungentlemanly. To shed a little light on this, we're joined now by regular Monocle 24 contributor Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at Birmingham University here in the UK. Good afternoon to you, Scott. Iran accusing Russia of ungentlemanly conduct. Whatever next?
Yeah, it's not that the Iranians would ever be ungentlemanly at any way. And of course, all these Russian airstrikes over Syria, killing civilians. Well, that's how could those be ungentlemanly in any way? To deal with the issue at hand, this was a Russian combination of a PR initiative and a possible new tactic in Syria's civil war that went badly wrong because it offended Iranian domestic opinion. In a nutshell, the Russians started bombing a week ago Monday from this base in western Iran. They hit all across northern Syria, including opposition-held territory. But they not only bombed, they went public with it big. All over Russian state media and then over Syrian state media, this was how Moscow was going to finally defeat the Islamic State and the terrorists. The problem is that no one talked to the Iranians about the publicity around this, it appears, because there was an immediate reaction in Iran which said, we don't want foreign military operating from our air bases. And I think what people may not realize in the media stories is that Iran pushed out the Soviet Union after World War II. Indeed, they not only pushed out the Soviet Union, they then pushed out the British. And there's a real sensitivity in Iran about any reentry of a foreign military. The idea is that the Islamic Republic is independent, that they do not take anyone's orders. And what happened is that Russia, at least in terms of appearances, crossed the line last week when they went big on the publicity for these bombings.
Well, Scott, that's really interesting because obviously, you look at how delicate the situation is here, and Russia very much the sort of number one ally of the Syrian government now. Is there a sensitivity then, to pick up on what you've just been saying there, within Iran about that, being displaced, if you like, as the number one ally? And do we actually need to look even further back, as you said, to World War II or even earlier and go right back to these, very fundamental battles for control of Central Asia, of the Caucasus regions as well, between, the Persian Empire, the Russian Empire. You've mentioned the British incursions as well a lot later. You need to bear all of those things in mind to make sense of this, right?
I mean, I think there will always be an Iranian sensitivity about Russian motives, and that's across a whole range of economic and political issues as well as military. But having said that, I don't want to go too far with this. At this point, the two countries are allied on the unconditional defense of the Syrian regime against the opposition, against rebels, as well as against the Islamic State. And they are not going to split over that. There is some question as to whether the Russians are willing to see President Assad go in the long term while the regime stays in place. The Iranians say that's a red line. Assad cannot be forced out. But in general, those two countries have drawn closer together since last autumn in terms of we're going to make a stand that Assad cannot be forced out by the rebels, and we're going to step up military escalation to do this, beginning with that Russian aerial intervention last September. So even if Russia is not allowed to use the Iranian airbase, that doesn't disturb the bigger picture. These are Assad's two essential allies, and without them, he is finished.
Scott, let me ask you then, if we look at this relationship, which is quite delicate, between Iran and Russia in particular, through the prism of Syria and the challenges there then, is it about the strategic relationship in terms of dealing with the threat of rebels and the threat of IS? Is it more about the diplomacy in terms of the relationship? Where do we need to look to see how their relationship progresses in the medium term?
I think you start with what each country wants and then see how this brings them together. I think for the Russians, this in a way is more of a tactical thing. They have had a long-standing military position in Syria, but it hasn't been a major one. This is more that Russia can throw its weight around in the Middle East, push aside the U.S. and the Europeans, and if the Syrian regime stays in power, Russia can then gain further economic and political benefits. For Iran, this is more of an existential matter. For a long time, Iranian officials would say that Iraq was the first line of defense for Iran's security. That has now changed. Because of the Iranian relationship with Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon, because of the need to maintain a line to Lebanon and to other areas of interest, such as Palestine, Iran sees Syria as essential. If Assad goes and the regime goes, Iran fears that it will not be thrown out of the region, but it will be very much on the defensive. And that's why I think they're becoming more rather than less aggressive in their defense of Assad.
Yeah, and Scott, just to kind of go full circle and come back to where we started about this issue of the Hamadan air base, it's interesting and perhaps predictable that the Russian military have, of course, released a statement subsequently saying, oh, well, we finished all our missions from there, so it was done anyway. That was to be expected, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's what we call covering your ass in American parlance, right? But that said, there's been a further development now where not only Russian officials, but some Iranian officials are trying to walk this back and say, well, perhaps the Russians can use the base for refueling. In other words, perhaps we can sort of quietly allow the Russians to go ahead and carry out operations from the air base, but by all means, let's not tell the world that that's what we're doing. We'll see how that plays out in the next few weeks to come, because the big backdrop for this is that, again, it is not that the Assad regime in Iran and Russia are in a strong position in Syria because of the rebel advance near Syria's largest city in Aleppo. The Russians and the Iranians are scrambling to find out what can be done to keep propping up Bashar al-Assad.
Scott, thanks for your time. As always, that's our friend Scott Lucas from Birmingham University joining us here on The Briefing.